anger is? Anger is simply the emotional energy to confront and correct injustice. That's why God gave us the ability to get angry. It's the emotional fuel to rise up and confront and correct injustice. And our world would be better off if we knew how, or did a better job at, getting angry at the things we ought to get angry at. Anger in and of itself is not inherently bad. It's actually a God-given capacity. Now, given that, our world should be a pretty good place, right? Because we're all using our anger to correct injustice. Or maybe we're not. Maybe when we think of anger, we don't think of this really cool thing that causes us to rise up and confront and correct injustice, but we think of all sorts of debilitating, destructive words and acts done in anger. How did anger get so destructive? When human beings became separated from God, and that separation was on us, not on Him, we're the ones that all walked away to some degree. God didn't go anywhere. But when we separated ourselves from God, a lot of things became darkened and twisted inside of us. And one of those things that got dark and twisted is our anger. And consequently, because of that darkness and twistedness, anger becomes destructive now for two basic reasons. The first thing that makes anger so destructive is when it arises for the wrong reasons. The intent of God is that we would feel anger when we saw injustice in the world. And we would rise up to confront it and correct it because what's going on there is wrong. It's hurting people. That's righteous anger. That's the kind of anger Jesus had. Did you know that Jesus got angry? Did you know that Jesus got mad? Look what the Bible says in the book of Mark, chapter 3. Jesus was in a house, a large house, talking to many, many, many people when he got tested. It says, Jesus then went into the synagogue again and noticed a man with a deformed hand. And since it was the Sabbath, Jesus' enemies watched him closely. Would he heal the man's hand on the Sabbath? If he did, they planned to condemn him. See, they had a rule. If you were a healer and you healed on the Sabbath, you were breaking one of the 10 Commandments and you were guilty of sin. And they wanted to see if you do it on the Sabbath day. You're going to break what? You're going to break our interpretation of one of the rules? You're going to mess with one of our standards we all accept as being righteous, Jesus? Jesus said to the man, "Come and stand in front of everyone." Then he turned to his critics and asked, "Is it legal to do good deeds on the Sabbath? Or is it a day for doing harm? Is this a day to save a life or a day to destroy it?" Well, now that's a question they hadn't thought of before. But they wouldn't answer him. How could they? And Jesus looked around in anger, because he was deeply disturbed by their hard hearts. Then he said to the man, "Reach out your hand." And the man reached out his hand and became normal again. And at once the Pharisees went away and met with the supporters of Herod to discuss plans on how to kill Jesus. You know what made Jesus angry? We're a bunch of people with a bunch of rules and a bunch of traditions that merely shackled, impoverished people and kept them from the freedom and healing that Jesus had to give. That made him mad. A little while later in his life, in Mark chapter 11, he was walking into Jerusalem where the temple was, and he noticed all of these people who were selling approved animals for an offering to give to God. And as they were selling these approved animals that you had to offer, they were selling them at an abnormally high price. And it ticked Jesus off. And it says he overturned the tables and he let all the animals go free and he threw the money into the wind and let it scatter absolutely everywhere. He was angered because people were being kept from a connection with God. They were kept from hearing the words of God. They were kept from praying so that they might move the heart of God. And when he saw this kind of injustice, when he saw people being taken advantage of, spiritually and economically, it made him mad. That's righteous anger. When there's an injustice that is harming other people, it's like we ought to get mad at that and do something to correct it and change it. But what happens with us so very often is our anger is just selfish. It's not some big moral injustice that has to be corrected. It's just that we didn't get what we wanted. When we wanted it, like we wanted it, how we wanted it. It's because we're inconvenienced. It's because our lives are made a little bit more difficult, a little harder. And those are those selfish reasons that give rise to so much of our anger. And that kind of anger can only destroy. God tried to teach us this lesson very early on. Like the 3rd chapter of the Bible. In a story of the 3rd and 4th people to ever make their appearance on the planet. Their names were Cain and Abel. Here's how a part of their story unfolds in the book of Genesis. It says, and when they grew up, Abel became a shepherd, while Cain was a farmer. And at harvest time, Cain brought to the Lord a gift of his farm produce, while Abel brought several choice lambs from the best of his flock. Get the picture? Time to give an offering to God. Time to show God you love him. Here comes Cain. I'm a farmer. I brought you some of my grain. Here comes Abel. I keep sheep. Here's some of the lambs from my flock. It says, the Lord accepted Abel and his offering, but he did not accept Cain and his offering. And this made Cain very angry and dejected. He's ticked off. Why? Because God wouldn't accept his offering. And so God says this. He says, Cain, why are you so angry? Why do you look so dejected? You will be accepted if you respond the right way. See, the problem was not that Cain brought grain. The problem was he didn't bring the best of his grain to offer to God. Like Abel brought the best of his flock. And that ticked him off. And so God says, look, if you just go do the right thing, if you'll bring me the best what you have to offer, then everything will be fine. But you know what happened with Cain? His anger grew. Here's the point it grew to. It said later, Cain suggested to his brother Abel, let's go out into the fields. And while they were there, Cain attacked and killed his brother. Because Cain did not get his way. Because Cain was inconvenienced. Because Cain's life was made a little bit more difficult by demand that was laid upon him, it gave rise to a selfish anger, and in that selfish anger, he became separated and angry from God, and he ended up hating and killing his own brother. And in the starkest of terms, God is simply letting us know that this self-centered anger is just lethal. It's just lethal. Why anger has become destructive? Because it no longer, I should say, it is seldom because we see an injustice being done to people and we feel compelled to rise up and do something about it. It's because we are being inconvenienced or we don't get what we want or our life is made a little harder or a little more complicated and then we just get mad. And that anger is destructive. What kind of anger do you have? Back in 1980, there was a 13-year-old girl. Her name was Carrie Leitner, and she was walking down a sidewalk on a very beautiful California afternoon when a car came recklessly driving by and struck Carrie and killed her. Turns out the man driving the car was under the influence of alcohol. Turns out he was actually on probation because he had struck another person while driving intoxicated. Carrie's mom, Candace, was grief-stricken, obviously, but also very